Hi, everybody. Joining me today is Roya Hakakian, an Iranian American journalist born in Tehran. Roya came to the United States as a refugee in 1985, having witnessed the 1979 Islamic Revolution in her early teens. She's the author of several books and a recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship in nonfiction. Her piece in the Free Press, which we're going to be discussing today, is called Fear, Humiliation, and Trump: Why Iran's Regime Could Fall. Roya, as we speak, protests are rocking Iran right now. Over the past 2 weeks, unrest has continued and gained momentum in Tehran and many other cities across the country in response to the country's weakening economy and the collapse of the Iranian currency. Yesterday, the government cut telephone and internet access, essentially plunging the country into a media blackout. So these are the biggest protests Iran has seen in years. Human rights groups are now reporting that at least 28 protesters have been killed since the protests started. What are you hearing from those inside the country right now?
I'm hearing a lot of tales of irreversibility, that uh, no matter what happens, this has to be done this time. This isn't to say that the protesters that showed up to the streets in 2022 or prior to that were less serious. They were not. But there is a sense of frustration and inability to compromise to any degree that has permeated these round of protests, which I think is quite exceptional. And that's sort of the message that you keep hearing coming out of Iran, that no matter what happens, something has to go one way or another this time.
And what initially sparked this round of protests?
That's really interesting because the initial headlines said the plummeting of the value of the dollar in Iran sparked a round of protests. And I, for one, was extremely just shocked by that headline, because if you have been watching Iran not for 100 years or 50 years, just for the last 10 years, you know that Iranians have had a consistent presence throughout the country in various protests all the time. So to say that somehow something happened this time around, or there was this one event that drew people on the street, is to detach what's happening now from the history of everything that has been happening in the past. So while, yes, there was a precipitating factor, which was the dropping of the value of the dollar, there is a long-standing series of issues that have brought Iranian to the streets throughout the years. And I think that's what we've been seeing. There was a trigger, and people came to the streets, but there was also that giant backdrop of all the other issues that have been dogging the nation for decades now.
So, what I'm hearing you say is that people have been protesting in Iran for many, many years on various different issues. And I'm actually hoping you can walk us through a bit the previous rounds of protests, when there was also, as you said, this hope of toppling the regime in 2009, the Green Movement again in 2017, 2019, and then in 2022 when women came out and marched on the streets of Iran. Can you give us a bit of a history on these protest movements?
Absolutely, but just humor me for a second, because I want to go back to 1979, because I think the mother lode of all the protests began really in March of 1979, and that's when it was barely 2 weeks after the Iranian Revolution had succeeded and Ayatollah Khomeini had returned to Iran after his exile, and he said in a sermon that he wanted to bring back the Islamic dress code to Iran, and it was going to become the law, and so women would have to be dressed according to the Islamic dress code. And on March 8th, 1979, barely a few days after the success of the Iranian Revolution, and when all of Iran was either absolutely in love with the Ayatollah or absolutely afraid of the Ayatollah, women took to the streets nonetheless on the International Women's Day, and they chanted, "We did not make a revolution to go backward." And I think it was at that moment, on March 8th of 1979, that 50% of the Iranian population, being women, declared their dissatisfaction with the status quo, which was brand new. And I think that was sort of the birth of the feminist movement in Iran as we see it in, going on in the last 48 years. So if we fast forward to the other very important moments, and even prior to 2009, there were many, many others. 2009 was hugely important because people took to the streets by the millions during that year, during the June of that year, because of a rigged presidential election. It was the second time that Mahmoud Ahmadinejad had run, and he clearly had lost the vote, had lost in the election, and nonetheless he was the one who was installed to his second term of presidency. And millions of people throughout Iran took to the streets, but there was something very important that those protesters were chanting, which these protesters are no longer chanting. Back then in 2009, people were saying, "Where is my vote?" Which meant that the system is legitimate. We believe in the validity of the elections. We just want you to do a recount. We want you to look into what happened. And so that fundamental break, fundamental rift between the nation and its leadership had yet to happen in 2009. But nonetheless, the riot police took over and drove the protesters. Nonetheless, the riot police took to the streets and arrested thousands, drove out of Iran, drove into exile many more, and imprisoned and executed a lot of Iranians. So that was a hugely climactic moment. Then there were the 27 round of protests due to an increase or the cutting of the fuel subsidies, which brought lower middle class Iranian to the streets. Then there was the 2019, and finally the most important one was 2022, which came on the heels of the murder of Mahsa Amini, an Iranian Kurdish girl in the custody of the morality police. And I think 2022 was the moment when nobody was in conversation with the regime anymore. Nobody was saying, our votes were taken away. We want to fix this. Mr. Supreme Leader, can we have a conversation? They were done. They were simply saying, death to the dictator, death to the Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, but also death to Ayatollah Khomeini, who was the founder of the Islamic Republic of Iran. So it was a fundamental rejection of the entire regime. And so we all know what happened in 2022, after about 10 days of massive protests throughout the country, mainly by women and the youth and university students. There were 20,000 plus arrests throughout Iran, and the killing of several hundred protesters, and basically the quashing of the movement that came to be known as the Woman Life Freedom Movement. And this brings us to 2025, which is what we're living through now.
Well, I wanted to ask you about that because, as you just alluded to, in the last rounds of big protest movements in Iran, the government has responded violently. Massive crackdowns, mass arrests, violence, killing protesters, killing civilians. You argue that in your piece today in the Free Press that this round of protests is different, not necessarily in the government's response, but I want to hear about that too. But what makes this round of protests different? Um, why are people speculating that this could be, let's say, the biggest one yet?
Well, in my piece, I cite five reasons, but I think there are more. And I think the most significant differences, the most significant factors are actually factors having to do with the global standing of Iran and other powers vis-a-vis Iran. But the first one, which was very shocking to anybody who's been watching Iran for the last half century, and especially those who know the history of the 1979 revolution really well, is that people who are middle class, conservative, upper middle class merchants in Iran, in Tehran, who are members of the bazaar, the main marketplace in Iran, have consistently been the supporters of the regime, and they were the ones who really were the financial artery of the last revolution. They were the financial supporters of 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini. And in 2025, they were the ones who began taking to the streets. So for the regime to lose its absolute most loyal base, the base that has either been supportive or quiet, this is a major change, and if not a major blow. The second very important factor is that one of the criticisms that many pundits had about the 2022 uprisings in Iran was that it's only an uprising of the Iranian youth and women. Where are other people? Where are the middle class? Where are the non-students? Where are the older people? Why is there not a kind of representative mix of all aspects of the Iranian society? This time around, you see everyone out on the streets. There are lower classes from poor neighborhoods throughout Iran, and there are obviously members of the bazaar who have traditionally been middle or upper middle class. The Persians, ethnic Persians throughout Iran are involved, as are Kurds and Baluchis and other ethnicities are involved. So this has an egalitarian sort of a combination of both ethnicities and classes, which is also very distinct from all the previous rounds of demonstrations. But I think the most significant and indisputably vital two factors that have emboldened Iranians and enabled them to somewhat confidently take to the streets has been the humiliation that Iran suffered as a result of the 12-day war last June, and also the tweet that President Trump wrote about, I don't know, less than a week ago, saying that if the regime goes on to deal violently again with these protesters, that the United States will have to respond. So these two factors, the pressures that Israel and the United States exerted on Iran, the elimination, decapitation of the Revolutionary Guard Corps, and the humiliation that they suffered as a result of their inability to respond in any shape or form, which really meant to the Iranian nation that they are incapable of protecting the nation. They're incapable of doing the one thing that they had hoped, with all their big guns and big military and big spending, they would be able to do, would be to protect, and to fight back. And they proved that they were incapable of doing that. And so that one thing that they had going for them, when it came to sort of reassuring the ordinary Iranians that, they were there for them, was also completely erased. And so that, plus the message that came from Washington that we will support you, have also been incredibly important.
So I want to dig into those last two reasons you mentioned a little bit further, because I agree with you. I think they're extremely significant. So, what is your sense? Obviously, you talked about how the Iranian regime's promise to its people was, we can provide you this security, and that veil was kind of peeled back in the 12-day war between Iran and Israel. Um, how has that shaped public opinion in Iran? What's your understanding of how that shaped public opinion among the people? And also, do you think that has encouraged the protesters to kind of keep going?
Yes, absolutely. So let's do a little bit of history again, because I think this is incredibly relevant. So Iran, in 1980, from 1980 to 1988, experienced one of the longest, bloodiest wars of the 20th century. Because it's in September of 1980, Saddam Hussein, or we should say the late Saddam Hussein of Iraq, the president, attacked Iran. He was certain that Iran, as a result of the revolution, change of regime, and also as a result of having opposed the United States by taking over the American embassy in 1979, in late 1979, and the embargo that had surrounded Iran, would be too weak to respond to an Iraqi attack. Well, the Iranians decided that they would go to war with Iraq, even though the country had been weakened as a result of everything that had happened. And Ayatollah Khomeini actually, who was always looking for a reason to, or I should say, who always thrived on both violence and chaos, welcomed the war as sort of a fantastic opportunity where he would have the chance to free Baghdad and then go on to free Jerusalem. So that was the plan. The plan was two stops to freeing, establishing his dream Palestine. But 8 years of war proved that there were no winners on either side, and so after about 1 million killed on both sides, and an equal number, if not more, maimed and injured, the two parties agreed to a ceasefire. But those nearly 10 years and the cost of that war, it left Iranians with a lasting trauma that lives to this day. So, there are children who don't even remember the historical events because they were too young, but they talk about the sound of bombings and how they felt traumatized by life in Iran in the 80s. So the one thing that this regime had always promised was that no matter what happens, we will fight for this country and we will protect the nation, and it will never become Afghanistan. Meaning that foreign armies will not invade. It will never become Iraq, meaning foreign armies will not be allowed to invade. And these two countries, by the way, are two neighboring countries of Iran. And so Iranians had this sense that, okay, whatever else is wrong with this regime, there's one thing that they can do. They can protect us. They can give us security. And what the June War proved was that one thing they could not deliver on. And it was at that moment that people thought, if they can't even do that, what are they good for? And so on one hand, this is what happened. On the other hand, all these very terrifying, personalities, the chief echelons of the Revolutionary Guard Corps, who had gone on to, basically batter the nation, especially throughout 2022 protests, were taken out one by one, as if they were flies that were being swatted. It was so effortless, and there was no resistance against the Israelis who were putting them out. So that also came. Of course, the general population, ordinary Iranians, rejoiced in the fact that all these people were being eliminated, but their own constituents, the regime's constituents, felt that this was an extreme form of humiliation that they learned through a very, very bloody experience, that this country, being Israel, that they have been mocking for 47 years, that they have been threatening to wipe off the map, in fact, wiped off their own leadership. So that humiliation, plus the loss of this promise of security, has really made all the difference.
And I imagine fear too. I'm sure many everyday Iranians felt fear now, not feeling as if they had that sense of security that the regime had promised them for so long. I'm curious how the regime is responding right now, to what the protesters are doing, to the concerns that they're raising. And what do you think? Do you think Trump's warning? I think he said that the Iranian regime would have to pay hell if they were to inflict violence on these protesters. Do you think that warning is having any impact on the regime's response?
Well, today the supreme leader gave a speech, and in his speech, he was more adamant than ever before about dealing very violently to the maximum extreme necessary in order to send the protesters home, and in order to alleviate their presence on the streets. I really read through those lines a sort of sense that he too recognizes, like the people on the streets, that this is it, that this is, if there is a final battle, this is the final battle. And if he's going to push, this is his last push. And he's going to, survive or die fighting to keep the system standing. And so the speech today was incredibly concerning. And the fact that the regime has gone on to, as you mentioned earlier, shut down the internet and phone communication, those two are extremely disconcerting signs, because this is how all atrocities, at least in the past century, anywhere in the world, have taken place. So I think the combination of the speech he gave, the blackout that is blanketing Iran right now, are incredibly concerning. And this means that the plan is to go about killing, arresting, executing, doing whatever it takes to deal with the demonstrators. And so my hope, as well as everybody else who has been watching this, the events of the past 10 days, is that President Trump has a plan to actually deliver on what he promised.
What do you think that plan would look like, or what do you hope that plan looks like?
Well, there are multiple ways of kind of imagining how that could unravel. On one hand, there are lots of underground forces, militia forces from within Iraq who are armed to the hilt, and they are trickling in from the Iraqi border into Iran in order to provide backup support to the riot police, to IRGC, and others on the ground. And so, one way would be to at least make sure that this flow is stopped, and then whatever it takes, and I'm sure the Delta Force and the military intellectuals here in Washington can think those through. But whatever it takes to prevent the actions that the security forces plan to take, I think making sure that somehow the access to internet gets restored is hugely important. So whatever other communication support services that can be provided to make sure that people can communicate with each other and protesters can be in conversation with each other is hugely important. And I think some other sort of negotiation, perhaps similar to whatever it was that convinced, say, Bashar Assad to take the bargain and leave Syria for Moscow, should be going on at the same time. That the threat should feel so tangible and so real to the top officials in the regime that they have to understand that they have a choice to make. Either they stand down and they take the bargain and they leave the country, or they will suffer the consequences if they carry on.
Do you think the United States' actions in Venezuela recently are having any impact on the regime leaders' calculations here?
But I am sure. I think it's not just. Maduro is sort of the icing on the cake, but the cake has several layers. It was the elimination of Hezbollah. It was the elimination of the leadership of Hamas. It was the toppling of the 50-year tyranny of the Assad regime in Syria. Again, Iran's practically backyard and chief playground in the region. So, to think that at the end of that chain comes the falling of Maduro, yes, of course, they are paying attention. And perhaps the 86-year-old supreme leader is in the position, by virtue of his age or his ideological commitments, unable to shift his position, but there are younger ones and there are more ambitious leadership within the IRGC who recognize that this thing is real.
Mm. I want to go back to the calls from the protesters. Um, what can you tell us about Reza Pahlavi? This is one of the names that protesters are now chanting in the streets of Iran, which I think many decades ago would have seemed unbelievable. So tell me about this. Why are protesters chanting for Pahlavi?
Reza Pahlavi, who is the crown prince of Iran and the son of the deposed Shah in 1979, has been living in exile in the United States for the past 48 years. And throughout this time, he has been searching for ways to create a powerful opposition that can face this regime and eliminate the regime. And in the past 4 or 5 years, especially since 2022, he has also emerged as the one figure that the nation seems to be solidifying around. Now, he himself doesn't have a political track record. It is primarily his grandfather and, of course, his father who were in the leadership of the nation. They were in charge. They have a history of leadership in Iran. but he is the heir to that legacy for which the nation feels incredibly nostalgic. And I think what seems to be, at least his message at this moment, is that he is willing to serve as a transitional figure that takes Iran out of this hellhole that it's living through at the moment, to the next phase, and say the next round of democratic elections in Iran, and that seems to be sort of a national consensus over which people have somewhat hopefully come around.
Roya, what would you say are the biggest takeaways? What are your biggest concerns right now? And what do you expect to happen next?
Um, all of that. I mean, every $1 million question that anybody can ask, you just asked. What I hope to happen is what I think anybody who doesn't care, who cares for Iran, but also cares for the cause of democracy and cares for the cause of stability, especially in the Middle East, should be wishing for, which is that the Islamic Republic of Iran, a tyranny that has brought misery not just to Iran, but to the region, and has been one of the most consistent destabilizing factor throughout the last 50 years, will be eradicated. And just like the rise of this regime in 1979 brought so many other historical consequences that changed not just the destiny of Iran and Iranians, but the region at large, one can deduce and hope that the falling apart of this entity will equally be or bring the same number of happy consequences this time around for Iran, for Iranians, and for the region. So I think, imagine a day, say, soon, I hope, when women in Iran actually get their wish to, dress as they wish, with or without the veil. Imagine what impact that would have on the neighboring Afghan women who have been very vocal about their desire to gain more rights, as much as this sounds and seems unfathomable to us right now. So it will be a very important democratizing factor for all the countries throughout the Middle East, and it is something that, Franny, I've been writing about a lot lately and thinking about a lot lately. It is what Iranians really deserve, because for more than 150 years, Iranians have been fighting to establish the rule of law in their country. And it seems to me that this journey of 150 years old needs to get to its final happy destination. And that's where I hope it will go.
Well, Roya Hakakian, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insights.
Thank you so much for having me on.